I want to take you back one more time to that night before Jesus was crucified. We talked about how many chapters there were and how impactful that night was, especially on the apostle. Which one? John, exactly, who became known as the love apostle because he spoke about love so much. And you remember that night that Jesus spent all that time with them just before the cross. He told them to love one another 5 times in that one conversation. He kept bringing them back to it. And I hope you are remembering the nature of that term, one another. It's that fancy word, that reciprocal pronoun, which means what? I resonate it to you, and you do what? You give it back. That's a very good way to point it. And so as we're both resonating these things toward each other, it becomes a wonderful thing to be a part of. Absolutely. Well, there's one more one another that Jesus laid down for his disciples that night before he was crucified. The other 5 wasn't enough. There was one more that he did. And when Jesus gathered his 12 disciples that night, John records this for us. Please turn to John chapter 13. We are still in John chapter 13, and I'm going to read for you verses 3 through 14 this morning. John chapter 3, verses 3 through 14. Listen to what John records about that night. And this is right at the Last Supper. Verse 3 says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had handed all things over to him, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, got up from supper and laid his outer garments aside, and he took a towel and he tied it around himself. Then he poured water into the basin and began washing the disciples' feet and wiping them with the towel that he had tied around himself. So he came to Simon Peter. He said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, what I am doing you do not realize right now, but you will understand later. Peter said to him, never shall you wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no place with me. Simon Peter said, Lord, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, he who has bathed needs only to wash his feet. Otherwise, he is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you. For he knew the one who was betraying him. It was for this reason that he said, not all of you are clean. Then, when he had washed their feet and taken up his garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, do you know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are correct, for so I am. So if I, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example so that you also would do just as I did. Truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who is sent greater than the one who sends him. And I read on a little bit further, but it's all good. Okay. I wanted to stop with the emphasis there on verse 14. So if I, the Lord and teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. What a saying. What a thing he was showing them that night. Now, what John didn't mention in the passage we just read, because you have to take all 4 Gospels and you have to put them together to get the picture of everything that happened. That's the way eyewitness reports work. Well, John didn't record everything for us. Now, Luke, the compiler, he's the details guy, and you're going to see that as we get to the Christmas season. We're going to start and we're going to go through Luke's Christmas, and then we're going to go all the way through the book of Luke, and that's going to take some time. Luke is the longest gospel because Luke gives you the most detail of any of the writers. That's the kind of guy Luke was. Well, Luke included some details for us that John did not. And if you turn over to Luke chapter 22, verses 24 through 27, I want to show you something else that was going on as Jesus was doing this to his disciples. As he was doing it, Luke chapter 22, verse 24. I still hear pages turning. That's wonderful. Luke records this. As they're at the Last Supper, he says, and a dispute also developed among them as to which one of them was regarded as being the greatest. And he, that's Jesus, said to them, the kings of the Gentiles domineer over those, and those who have authority over them are called benefactors. But it is not this way with you. Rather, the one who is the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the what? Servant. Very good. For who is greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves? Is not the one who reclines at the table? But I am among you as the one who serves. Not only did he tell them to serve one another, but he gives them this tremendous example as they're fighting amongst themselves about what were they fighting about? Who was the greatest? What an ego bath, you know? I mean, they're all in this room together. I mean, can you imagine that? Here they are having dinner with Jesus, and he gets up and puts a towel around his waist and goes around the room washing their smelly feet, and they are arguing with each other which of them is the greatest. Sometimes we are so thick. We see, and we saw in the other one, you know, Peter, he's not going to let Jesus do it. Peter has to think of something to say. No matter what's going on, Peter has to think of something to say. And it's often not the right thing. But they're all fighting with each other at the table of this very last supper that they're having together. Granted, I understand that they didn't know that this was the night. They didn't know. To them, it was just another dinner. They were coming together. They were getting ready for the Passover. They were doing all this. And so they didn't know that he was going to the cross tomorrow because he'd only told them 10 or 20 times, right? And it just wasn't sinking in. But Peter declared, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." They knew who he was. There was no question. That was just a little bit earlier in Caesarea Philippi. And Jesus said, "Who do men say that I am?" And Peter, always having to have something to say, came up with the right answer and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And after they got done there, it says just 6 days later, they walked up on a mountain, and he was transfigured before them. What does that word mean? Changed. It's like he let a little bit of the God inside him show out through that flesh that was hiding it all. Because it's recorded, and it says there in Matthew 16:16, and his face shone like the sun. You know, you can't look directly at the sun, right? And that's what it was like to look at his face. And it says, and his garments were as white as light. He was changed, and it's like that God inside him was just kind of showing out through it. And they had just seen all these things. The point there is they knew who he was. This one that was going around the table washing their feet, they knew exactly who he was. It wasn't just another man. They'd seen him walk on water. They'd seen him feed thousands. They'd seen him calm storms and heal untold numbers of people. Miracles that had never been done. How often was it, you read through the Gospels, and how many times did it say, you know, he healed this blind man? It's like, and this has never been done, right? They had seen all these things. Yet here he was doing the job of the lowest slave of the house. Washed their feet. And they were arguing over who was the greatest. Even if they didn't know all of that, even if he were just their rabbi, who would have thought it was appropriate for them to allow him to wash their feet? He speaks to them in human terms for a little bit, right? He says, "You call me master, and I am, so you're right." And who's supposed to do the serving, the master or the servant? The servant. Yet here I am, you're reclining at the table, and I am washing feet. Every one of them should have been jumping to their feet and saying, "Oh no, Lord, let me get that," right? Wouldn't you think so? But how many of them did? None. Not one. They let him do that and serve them as if he was the lowest servant of the house. This was God on his knees, serving his own disciples by doing the most menial job of the house. Brings one more thing to mind for me that separates Christianity from other religions of the world. Last week I told you one of the key things that's different between our religion and other religions is we know that every religion, every God, small g, requires a sacrifice, and only ours did what? Became the sacrifice. I'm glad you were listening because that was a really important point. One of the other major differences between our religion and other religions is that I will say most religions, because I'm not totally sure, but I think it is all other religions, are transcendent. Transcendent means I am here on earth and I must work my way up to God. That's what transcendent means. I will arise to him. Our God is condescending. Condescending, meaning he came down to us and lifted us up. Isn't that wonderful? He stooped down in the dirt just like he did for the disciples here where he was washing their feet. The God of the universe is on his knees with a towel wrapped around his waist and a basin of water washing the dirt off the feet of the people he created. And then he lifts us up. That condescension is part of the model that Jesus was trying to get across to them. It is good that we condescend to each other. Romans 12:16, the King James uses that word. That's why I'm going to read it from that. And it's a beautiful translation, but it says, condescend to men of low estate. We shouldn't be all high and uppity around each other and trying to be above each other like the disciples sitting around the table arguing about who's the best. What should we be doing? We should be the ones on our knees. And if somebody needs us to get down there to help them, what should we do? Get down there with them and help them. I think Gary in Sunday school, he was talking about how we are as grandparents, you know. Granddaughter, grandson says, Grandma, Grandpa, man, our hands are out and we're picking them up and we're all that. And you know what? We'll go further than that for them, won't we? We will get down on our hands and knees to pick them up. I remember when I came home from Africa years ago, tomorrow is 9/11, so don't forget, because it is the day we said we would never forget. Right? Most of us have. And we said we never would, but just after 9/11, it was only about a month after that, I was coming home from Africa, and so security was so tight in the airports and stuff. I remember Lisa came with the kids to pick me up at the airport, and our little girl, she was probably only about this tall at that time, she came running through security. You know, when she saw me, I tell you, I dropped to my knees. Grabbed that little girl, and one of the new TSA guys, he started reaching for her. I'm like, don't you dare. It's my baby girl, and you will not get between us, you know. It's condescending. That's what our God does for us. He drops to his knees, takes us in his arms. We have a condescending God. It's the mindset also that we should have, that Jesus is trying to get across to these knucklehead disciples. I mean, at least Peter did seem to have a little bit of awareness. Like I said, he's always looking for something to say in every occasion. And in verse 8 there, it says, Peter said to him, never shall you wash my feet. Well, at least he caught on to that, but it's not like he exactly jumped up and took the towel from Jesus in the basin and said, here, Lord, let me do that. I'm too busy defending my position with these other yahoos. I can't get on my knees in front of them. I'll lose any place I have. But he did look to Jesus and say, no, you're not washing my feet. And I think with all this going on, it may have been precisely why Jesus gave them the example he did, because of the way they were jockeying for position. And so he gave them this object lesson. I'm sure they were sitting or reclining around the table, fighting, no, it's me, and blah, blah. And it's going back and forth, just testosterone flying through the room. And they're all getting angry with each other about who should be in charge. And Jesus quietly goes over to where the servant left the things, picks them up, and starts going around the room and washing their feet. Like a servant. And he says this, "Do you know what I have done for you?" It's like, are you paying attention? Did you see this? Did you see what I just did? "You call me teacher and Lord, and you are correct, for so I am. So if the Lord and the teacher washed your feet," what does he say? "You also ought to wash one another's feet." And there's that one another word for us, right? There's that reciprocal pronoun. It should be going back and forth all through here. You look around the room, and these are your one another's, and we should be doing these things for each other. Now, let me clarify. It's not about washing feet, okay? That was a very practical thing that needed to be done at that time. They walked around in their sandals, and there were animals in the streets, and there were things you didn't want in your house, so people came over and you washed their feet. Now, we miss that at times, that it's a very practical thing, and so we have foot washing services in churches sometimes. How many have ever been to one of those? Few of you have, about half of you actually. Well, we've had those, and I'm not really a fan of them because I've had some really ugly feet most of my life. And I don't like them being seen. After a few surgeries, they look better. I'll be walking and I'll see my footprint and I'm like, oh, that looks so much better. But I never wanted people washing my feet because it was pretty humiliating. These scars are actually better than the way the stubs used to look. But anyway, it's not about, we try and make things and say, oh, we should wash one another's feet, so let's have a foot washing service. In Gary's words, that's not practical theology. That's an emotional experience we can have, and I'm not putting it down, but it's missing the point. And the other reason I don't necessarily like doing those is because Jesus is not talking about washing feet specifically. He is talking about the disciples being willing to humble themselves and to take the position of the servant and serve, what next? One another. Why isn't one of you yahoos getting up from the table and taking care of your brothers here? There was something that needed to be done, and no one else wanted to do it. And he stepped in and took care of it. This morning, we are talking about serving one another. John records Jesus using that reciprocal pronoun again, one another. We've pointed it out a few times this morning, which means that this is something that should naturally reverberate in our numbers. Naturally. It is something that should just be going on between me and you and the person next to you and all of us in here. We all should be serving one another. And what is reverberating between us is this. This is a key point. An attitude of humility that is accompanied by acts of service toward each other. I will repeat that one for you so you can remember it. It is an attitude of humility that is accompanied by acts of service toward each other. The humility has to come first, or it's not going to work. We should all be on the giving end and the receiving end of acts of service from our fellow members of the body of Christ. Every one of us. If you're not one of every one of us, raise your hand. Okay, nobody did. Good. If you are one of every one of us, raise your hand. Then you should be on the giving end and the receiving end of acts of service. And that is what this is all about. That is how we take care of each other. Turn with me to Philippians chapter 2, verses 3 through 8. We're all on the giving end and the receiving end of this attitude that is accompanied by acts of service toward each other. I was preparing this while you're turning, just a little rambling here while you catch up. You ever notice in the bookstores, they always have a self-help area? Have you ever found the area yet on helping others? We need to be on the giving end, the receiving end, right? Philippians 2, verses 3 through 8. You may remember this from when we went through the book of Philippians. Paul writes this, Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility consider one another, there it is again, as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. Have this attitude in yourselves, which also was in Christ Jesus, who, as he already existed in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a bondservant and being born in the likeness of men and being found in the appearance of a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, death on a cross. Paul was not there that night that Jesus washed the disciples' feet, but the night must have surely come to mind when he wrote this passage, I think. He had heard about it from the others. He was a very close companion of Luke's, and Luke recorded this for us and that night for us, as did John and the others, and he knew about it. And I have to think that when he wrote this passage, that night must have been very, very firmly in his mind. Right down to the arguing over who was the greatest. Paul starts out with that, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, which would pretty much describe the 12 disciples reclining around the table at that time, right? And Paul tells us right there a few points. Number one, with humility, consider one another as more important as yourself. We're going to come back to that verse for more exposition on it later, but we should consider one another as what? More important than ourselves. You and your need is more important than what? Me and my need. Yes, exactly. And that is what he's saying. We'll spend some time on that a little bit later, but these two things tie together quite nicely between how we consider ourselves and how we consider other people and our ability and our willingness to get on our knees and serve them. The second thing I want to point out here, he says, have this attitude in yourselves, which is also in Christ Jesus, who, as he already existed in the form of God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, or he didn't hang on to that and say, no, I'm God, I'm not going, but emptied himself, taking on the form of a what? Servant. To serve. It's all about the attitude. Let me ask you this. Are there any tasks or needs that your brothers and sisters sitting around you might have that are below you? I mean, you could look at something and say, I'll do this, but I'm not doing that because that's below me. If I think that, am I capturing the attitude of Christ? Because let me tell you, everything was below Christ. Coming to the earth was below Christ. Walking in a world that was full of sin when he was sinless, the Son of God, when he could have never had to expose himself to all the things he walked through in this world, it was all below him. Though Jesus was God and had all the power and the rights to rule everything as God, he made himself a servant. And in a time of slavery, the early Christians fully understood what it meant to be a servant. We put the word servant in there because it does sound a lot better, doesn't it, than slave. He came down and he took the position as a slave. It was more likely than not a large number of the early Christians who were reading that passage in Philippians were slaves because 30% of the Roman Empire was slaves. 30%, 1 out of 3 people. That means if we were gathering like this in our church, well, especially since we're not like the super rich church and all that, right? We're pretty much blue-collar working people, and it's wonderful, and that's who we are, and it probably means almost all of us would have been slaves gathering like this. They knew what that meant. That's that condescending thing. You mean Jesus Christ came down and took my job and did what I do? Yes, he did. So the point of serving one another is this: we willingly and joyfully set aside our own position, our own status, and our own needs, and we look to the needs of someone else, and we do something about it. It's that simple. What a witness it was to the world of that time. Can you imagine this? for a world full of slavery to see masters tending to the needs of slaves. And yet it was going on in churches all through the Christian world. It's really what the book of Philemon gets down to. Paul tells Philemon, he's sending his slave back to him. He says, now you welcome him as anybody remember what he told him to welcome as? A brother, not a slave. Masters doing things to help those whom society saw as below them. That is the attitude that Christ demonstrated. That is what we are to follow. I want to make a very clear distinction about serving when I do this today, because usually when you hear a message on serving, and I'll admit, usually when I talk about serving, I am talking about serving in the church, exactly. Taking up volunteer positions and stuff like that. Getting involved in church, cleaning the church, serving in children's church, which I will say, we're going to need more people doing that as we grow. We're getting new age groups coming in, and this is all important stuff, isn't it? Serving in the sound room, I'll tell you, there's not much more of a thankless job than serving in the sound room, other than I can't see you if you're sleeping, as long as you wake up before the next slide is due. But it's kind of like being a goalie. When you're doing your job, nobody sees it. But boy, if there's a mistake, every one of your heads goes over there, I always think, what's higher stress than being the goalie? You make a mistake, and an alarm goes off, and lights start flashing. No covering. Serving by taking care of the finances and keeping the books. We have people doing that for us as a church. And we usually think of jobs that need to be done around the church. Or we could sum it up and say volunteering. Usually when you hear a message on serving, that's what you think of, right? I will say just last week we had an amazing demonstration of this kind of serving. My heart was blessed to see you all jumping up and taking care of that water. You guys didn't, well, what are we going to do? I guess we're going home. Man, everybody started grabbing shop vacs and floor suckers, whatever you call those things, carpet cleaners, and squeegees and mops and anything that would move water. And you were all over there cleaning. And we got to go ahead and have church. Wasn't that beautiful? And that was a wonderful thing. And that was a great chance for us to serve. There were people who came here all through the week and emptied dehumidifiers and unlocked doors to let the professional carpet cleaners in. And thank you all for doing that, really. I mean it. That's what keeps the church going. And that is important. Those are all valid things, and they definitely are needed. And we get to sit here and have church together this morning because a number of people come here and they do the things that need to be done so we as a church can exist. Almost all the improvements on the facility here have been done by volunteers. Well, I don't think we hired any of those improvements other than the furnace, which was kind of an emergency thing. But, it was all done by volunteers to make this a better place for us to worship in. I don't know if you've noticed this, and I'll probably get in trouble with this, but I've never known a pastor's wife who does as much church around volunteers. You hire me, you didn't hire her. She's here volunteering all the time to serve the church. I have never known another pastor's wife work as hard on that stuff as she has. It's all important. No church can survive without it. We can't pay every position, right? And I'll admit, most of the times we've talked about serving, those are the kind of things that I am talking about, but that is not what we're talking about today, and I want this to be really, really clear. That is not what we're talking about today. This is a little bit different. This is about serving one another, looking around the room and seeing the people around you and serving them. I'm going to take you to a verse that's a little bit different because it's talking about giving. But if you were to look at Luke chapter 6, verse 38, it's not in the slides, but if you were to look at that, some of you probably know that by heart. I know some of you can say it by heart. It is usually spoken of in reference of giving and giving to the church or putting something in the offering or something like that. Luke writes, Jesus saying this, "Give and it will be given to you, they will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you again. We usually use that verse almost every time. I don't know if I've ever heard someone else use that verse when it was not talking about like giving to the church or giving to missions or giving to this or that cause, and saying, because you did that, God is going to bless you and it's going to come back on you. But that's not really what Jesus is talking about here. Jesus is talking about people. They weren't passing the offering plate yet. The church wasn't established yet. That came about in Acts chapter 2, right? This is in Luke chapter 6. See, there's more George Bailey about this verse than theology. You know who George Bailey is? How many know who George Bailey was? It's a Wonderful Life. Almost said It's a Wonderful Christmas. It's a Wonderful Life. I got to get it right anyway. George Bailey, he's the main character of that, played by Jimmy Stewart, Jimmy Stewart. And it's about a man who gave his life and served and sacrificed through his whole life to take care of other people. He was always saying, well, they need this, and they need this. And he was always setting aside his goals and his dreams and his intentions so that he could take care of other people. Well, he never saw the blessing of everything he was doing until one day his life fell apart and he was facing jail because his building and loan company came up short in the books through an innocent error. It was actually his uncle's error, if you remember. I can't give away the whole movie, even though it's like 100 years old, and I know you've all seen it, but it wasn't even his error, and he was facing jail, and so his life was falling apart. And on that night where they were coming to arrest him, the whole town remembered everything he had done for them, and they all flocked to his house and began giving back to him whatever they had. If they had $1, if they had $2, whatever they had, they brought it and they put it in this basket, and it was just like that verse, piled up and heaping over. They gave whatever they had, and it was just literally like that, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. And the movie ends with a toast on Christmas Eve by his brother saying, "To George Bailey, the richest man in town." That's what that's talking about in the way that we give to others or serve others. What Jesus is really saying is it will come back around. And it's about giving to people, not volunteering at the church, which I'm not discouraging volunteering at the church or giving to the church. That's just a different subject. But that is the return Jesus is talking about. There were people, and there were people who gave and served, and he was saying, if you give and serve to people, people will be there to give and serve when you need it. And more will come back to you than you can give. What goes around comes around in a good way too. See, this is different. This is serving one another, not serving the church. You look around the room and you see someone who needs some help with something, and you step in, and what do? You help. You just do something. I want to involve you a little bit this morning. I just want a few shout-outs here, no half-hour messages or examples, but I want you to think back over your life. Think of a time when you needed some kind of help, and someone reached out to you and helped you meet that need in a practical way. Have you ever been there? When were you backed up against a wall or stranded or whatever, and somebody helped? Anybody been there? Tell me quickly, just 5 words. What happened? Bob. Projects here at church, yes, because Bob organizes a lot of projects, and people step in and help him out with that. I heard something else over here. Your mom. Wow, okay, very practical example, right? This is practical theology. Give me another one. Beep, beep. Dad. Okay, yep, his brother-in-law replumbing his house while he was at work. Great. One more. Give me one more. Oh, that's nice. Supervisor at work praying for you when you were having a hard time. Those are all great things. Now let's turn it around. What can you do for someone else who needs it? Give me some examples of how we can do it. What are some simple, practical things you can do to serve one another? Pray for them. Good. That's good. Getting more practical even. Bob? Lend a hand. Yep. If you can, lend a hand. Tim? Okay, I have that on here in my examples. You may see some people around you who need help with their yard cleanup because they just can't get out there and do it themselves anymore, right? And you can step in and do it. Give me one more good example. What is a practical way we can get in there and get on our knees and help?
Helping a friend that's down and out.
Okay.
With them and comfort them and listening to them.
Listening to them, that's a good one. People need to be listened to sometimes. Absolutely. Few examples I have here is you see someone who needs help up or down the stairs right over here because in 1960 someone thought it was that a tri-level was a good idea. You know? Helping people up and down those stairs, or even if somebody can't go up the stairs, what if you go up and get them a plate and bring it back down for them? Might even want to find out what they would like first, you know? How about that? You help them up and down the stairs, or maybe you get them a plate, something like that. You are driving to church and you notice you go by somebody's yard and you notice that their yard is not shoveled. The days are coming, folks. It is September. And they can't get out to do it themselves. What could you do? Shovel it. Yes. I mean, you could call the deacons, but you could also just get out there and lend a hand and shovel it. Roll up your sleeves and do something about it. As Tim mentioned, fall is coming. Do you know someone who needs help with their leaves? There's some people in this congregation who aren't spring chickens, right? And they might need some help with some yard cleaning and stuff. And you don't have to come to me and say, hey, Don, I think we need to rally the troops and do this. You can grab a rake and go to their house and do it, right? I told you how the church just seemed to be at its best when our son Brian died and people cooked meals. You know somebody that could use a meal? I mean, they may just be stressed at work or whatever, and you're just going to take them a meal. Absolutely. Things like this. Do you know somebody who has trouble keeping up with their lawn? Can you help them? You're driving by and you see, well, but I know they're not able to get out there and do that. So I can just stop by and mow their lawn for them. I'll tell you that I'll get in trouble with this too, but please understand, I don't say this to brag on him, but to show examples. My father-in-law comes over twice a week and mows my lawn. And he does a nice job too. If he was hiring out, I'd recommend him, but does a real nice job. And he does that so that I can work on this stuff. And he's even said, just to rest. That's serving one another. You can do that for each other. I know someone in here who just went over to somebody else's house and helped install a new phone for him. That's wonderful. Does somebody need help getting groceries? Does somebody need repair on their car? Does somebody have a clogged drain? Does someone need someone just to come by and check on them and make sure they're doing okay? That is serving one another. If we are living in a community, if we know each other the way we ought to, especially in a smaller church, if we are close, these things should be happening all the time in our congregation because we see each other and we can look at each other and say, you probably need help with this. I'm coming over to help out. Then without us having to set up a ministry to find out who needs help and organizing a ministry, go take care of it, we just pick up and do it for each other. However, if you want to do that, you have something to offer and you don't know who needs the help, please reach out to us and we'll try and connect you. We talked about love being the earmark of the disciples of Jesus Christ. That love is how they will know we are his disciples. Well, let me tell you this, serving one another is love in action. We say, I love you every time we do something like that for someone. Let me give you a couple qualifiers for serving one another this way. Number one, do it with the right attitude. That is what that whole passage in Philippians chapter 2 is about. Do it with the right attitude. Number two, do it without expecting anything in return. You're not doing it for what they can do for you. You're doing it, Philippians 2 said, do not merely look at your own personal interests, but also at the interests of others. It's not about you. Number three, do it gladly. If you're going to do it, don't complain about it, right? Because that kind of steals all the blessing. Besides that, one of the one another's, James 5:9 says, do not grumble or do not complain against one another. There's negatives in there too that we shouldn't do. Don't complain, he says. Number four, don't grow weary of doing it. Listen to this verse, Galatians 6:9 and 10, which I do believe is on your memory verse list. Let's not become discouraged in doing good. No, this one is not. For in due time we will reap if we do not become weary. So then, while we have an opportunity, let's do good to all people, and especially those of the household of faith. There's some wonderful stories in the Bible, and just as I'm wrapping up here, I want to share one from you from the book of Acts, chapter 9, verses 32 through 43. It will be up on the screen. Listen to this story. It's a beautiful story. Now in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas. This woman was excelling in acts of kindness and charity, which she did habitually, but it happened at that time that she became sick and died. And when they had washed her body or got her ready for the funeral, they laid it in an upstairs room. Since Lydda was near to Joppa, the disciples, having heard that Peter was there, sent 2 men, urging him, do not delay in coming to us. So Peter got ready and went with them. When he arrived, they brought him into the room upstairs. And all the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing all the tunics and garments that Dorcas used to make while she was with them. But Peter sent them all out and knelt down and prayed, and turning to the body, he said, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and raised her up, and calling for the saints and widows, he presented her alive. It became known all over Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And Peter stayed in Joppa many days with a tanner named Simon. This is a story of a woman who lived in what we would today is called Tel Aviv on the coast of the Mediterranean. And she was well known for one thing, her sewing. She sewed. She was also known for another thing, and that was being a disciple of Jesus Christ. Now, we said that love was the earmark of our being recognized as disciples of Jesus Christ. And obviously, she was doing that because it wasn't just that she was sewing, but it was who she was sewing for. When we read this story, you realize she is sewing for the poor. She is making clothes for people in the church there who cannot get clothing for themselves, and she is making it for them. She's doing what? She's serving them by making them clothing. That's why she had a nickname. Her name was Tabitha. That's very nice. It means a gazelle. That's a very nice name. But they nicknamed her Dorcas. Now, that name did not mean the same thing as it would have if someone had nicknamed you that in the 1970s, okay? It's not the same thing. That nickname was after the kind of shirts and clothes she was wearing. She had made so many of these shirts, so many of these cloaks for people that they named her after the kind of thing she made. And that's how they identified her. She's the shirt maker. And all these people who needed clothes would come to her, and she would give them clothes. He says there in verse 36, this woman was excelling in acts of kindness and charity, which she did habitually. It's who she was sewing for that was so important. She was practicing exactly what we are talking about and doing it purely for the needs of others. And she got sick, and she died. Her impact on the church, doing her acts of service, had such an impact on the church that when she died, the church cleaned her body, got her ready for the funeral, got it all set up upstairs, and they sent to Peter. We're not going to just any of the apostles, but Peter. Let's go to the church leadership and let him know this woman who served us so well has just gotten sick and died. I don't know exactly what they thought he was going to do. I don't know if they thought he would raise her from the dead, or he would just come to the funeral, or just come and comfort them. But they were so touched by what this woman had done for so many. They sent, and Peter came a-running with the guys, the messengers that went to him. And when he arrived, it's this beautiful picture. He is walking up to this upper room where they had laid her body, and all along it's lined with people who are standing there holding up the garment she made for him. What a tribute. And he has to walk past them, and they're all standing there crying, holding up the shirt or the jacket or whatever she had made for them. It ended well because Peter prayed. He told her, "Arise," and she came back to life. But this all happened because this woman, never noted anywhere else in the Bible, took her time, her needle, her thread, and her scissors, and started making clothes for people who couldn't afford any. Serving one another will touch many more people than we realize when we are doing it. One more verse, and this one is in your memory verse list. Galatians 5:13. For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity of the flesh, but serve one another through love. That's what we're called to do. Serving one another is where we lay down our rights and our needs and our intentions and our dreams. We see someone else in need and we do something about it. That's what we're called to do. That is one of the ways we will reverberate the love of God back and forth inside this congregation. Imagine the impact that will have on our number and on the world around us if we are loving each other in very practical ways like this, without being asked, without being coerced. We are just doing it because we love each other. We do it for the Lord, and He is pleased, and people will say things like, "Oh, I thought your car was broken down. How did you get to work today?" And you smile and you say, "Well, Ron, a guy from church, he fixed it for me." You know? Someone will say, "That's a nice jacket you're wearing," and you will say, "Thank you. Dorcas, a woman at my church, made it for me, mended it for me, because I needed a coat." And people will think, "Wow, they must really take care of each other at that church." And you will say, what? Yes, we do. We serve one another. And they will say, "Man, I wish I had something like that in my life." Everybody wants to belong to something like that. My challenge to you right now is to look and to see what you are doing for others, for those around you. Let me ask you, are you showing love in that way? Think about it for yourself. When is the last time you did get down on your knees for somebody else and take care of something they couldn't? Without being asked. Are you on the giving end? Are you on the receiving end? We should all be both. What would God have you do? Let's be a people who live out our love in very practical ways, this, like we said, for each other by setting aside what we want and serving one another.